everyone, live in Efrat. We are in Parshat Matot Masai, Parshat Matot Masai, the last two Parshiot of Bamidbar. We are learning the Zera Shimshon. We're going to learn two pieces, Bezrat Hashem, in the Drushim of Masai. Parshat Matot has the stories of, we have first not the stories, but the halachot of making vows and oaths, which will be relevant, Bezrat Hashem, in the second drush. And in the first, and then there also have the deal that Moshe makes with Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, or the agreement between Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven and half of Menashe. That's in Parshat Matot, and we also have the death of Aaron in Parshat Matot. And then Masai, which is known as it ends it summarizes the entire stories of the entire Sefer Bamidbar by telling us all the 42 different places that within the Midbar that Bnei Israel traveled to. Sometimes it was longer, sometimes it was shorter. And in the beginning of this week's Parshat, the beginning of that part of the Parshat Masai, we have two psukim that are unique, and the Zera Shimshon picks up on it and teaches us something about what happened in Mitzrayim as during the time of Makat Bechorot. So we're on Drush Aleph of Parshat Masai. It's on page 711 in the Art Scroll edition, and on page, I'll tell you in a second, Parshat Masai is on page Shin Kav Gimel in the Minukad version, and so it goes as follows. Mitzrayim Mikabrim. It's a pasuk perik in Bamidbar, perik lamed gimel, pasuk dal. It says Mitzrayim Mikabrim. Mitzrayim Mikabrim. It says V'Elohim asa shvatim, asa Hashem shvatim. Kashe dema inyan Mitzrayim Mikabrim imu V'Elohim asa Hashem shvatim. So the pasuk is describing right as the Parshat Masai, as mentioned, is the discussion of all the different places that Bnei Israel left and journeyed through as they went through the Midbar. And it starts obviously as they left Mitzrayim, and so it says Umitzrayim Mikabrim, and it says the Egyptians, the Mitzrim, were burying those that Hashem had killed, and Makat Bechorot, and on their gods, that is their idols, Hashem had inflicted punishment. And so the Zera Shimshon asked, the first question is, what is the interconnection between Mitzrayim Mikabrim, the fact that Bnei Israel, what is the fact that the Mitzrim were burying their loved ones, have to do with the fact that Hashem inflicted punishment on the Mitzrim's idols or gods? Why should they be mentioned together at all? Right? One has to do with the fact that Hashem. One of them is talking about what the Mitzrim's response was, and the other one is what was what was going on with Hashem. And so it seems like there's some sort of connection between the two, and as Zera Shimshon is asked what it is. And the way we figure out how do we know that they're really connected, because you say Uve Elohem, the word Uv definitely connect, the letter Vav connects between the two parts of the pasuk, and therefore the Zera Shimshon is in some ways bothered by that. And then in order to explain that, in order to understand what the question really is, Zera Shimshon starts with the quote from the Rabbeinu Bechaya in Parshat Bo, which obviously is connected to here because it's Yitziat Mitzrayim. So he says, Katav Abachaye Parshat Bo, Shabalayla lo hirgishu b'makat Elohehem, lefi shayu trudim b'makat Bechorot, aval b'boker kshalchu lebeit Elohevotam, hikiru v'gishu k'mo shematzinu b'dagon b'mei plishtim. So the Zera Shimshon starts his answer by saying is that according to Rabbeinu Bechaye, he says that at night the Mitzrim didn't feel the punishment that Hashem inflicted upon the gods or the idols of the Mitzrim, because they were so busy burying their own and mourning their own the deaths of their firstborn. And that's why when describing the Makat Bechorot in Sefer Shemot, it doesn't mention the fact that Hashem inflicted any punishment on their gods, because it only mentions it respect to the next morning, because when it was going on, Ad Kad Loshanos. So that's the Rabbeinu Bechaya is saying, is that because at the time of Yitziat Mitzrayim, or at the time of Makat Bechorot, at night the Mitzrim were so busy with the mourning and the shock and awe of the fact that all the firstborns of all over Mitzrayim were being killed. So it doesn't discuss the fact that Hashem inflicted some sort of punishment upon their gods. That's what Rabbeinu Chaya says. And now he says, the Zera Shimshon takes that idea and develops it even further to really understand, to explain to us something that was a little bit more profound. And he says, if we look in the previous pasuk of this week's parsha, this was the first pasuk that the Zera Shimshon quotes is pasuk Dalet. So now if we look in pasuk Gimel, it says, it says that the day after Pesach, that is at night, the next day, meaning that at night Bnei Israel were makriv the Korban Pesach, and the next morning Bnei Israel left with an upraised hand, the Yad Ramah, in front of all of the eyes of Egypt, in front of them. And so it says that Hashem, it seems to say, at least when it says, B'macharat ha-Pesach, B'macharat ha-Pesach yatzu Bnei Israel. It seems, the reason why it says B'macharat ha-Pesach, there's obviously something that's telling us something there too. The Kasheh, V'ishlam imaya mamtin laboker, ad sheyeh le'nei olam neicha, right? He says, if the pasuk would have said, U'minacharat ha-Pesach yatzu Bnei Israel b'yad ramah le'nei kol ha'olam, or le'nei kol ha'amim, or something like that, then the Zera Shimshon says, then I would have understood it, because that can make sense why Hashem decided to delay, so that way during the day, the heat of the day, Bnei Israel everyone would see that Bnei Israel is leaving. But that's not what it says. It says Le'nei kol Mitzrayim. Aval Le'nei kol Mitzrayim hayam mitkayem af halayla, right? If you think about it, at the time of Makat Bechorot, Bnei Israel could have easily just left at night too. During the Makat Bechorot, after the Makat Bechorot, in the middle of the night, they could have left, and Mitzrayim would have seen it too, and that would have been Mikayem the Pasuk, Le'nei kol Mitzrayim. And then he adds, and he says, in fact, what would we have thought would have happened if it had been Israel left at night during Makat Bechorot or right afterwards? The Mitzrayim would be so angry or so upset or whatever it would be, they would say, so just get out of here, get out of our face. Right? And he says, Lamtin laboker, the Zera Shimshon says, but in fact the opposite. Had we waiting or maintaining the fact, staying in Mitzrayim at that point is actually dangerous for Bnei Israel, because right now Bnei Israel, the Mitzrayim understand that Bnei Israel are the ones who caused this situation with all the Becholot, and therefore the Mitzrayim could have said, wait, no, now that the punishment's over, you're staying in Mitzrayim is not advantageous to us, and we don't want you to leave, just like they did with all the other Makot, where they said, yes, we'll let you leave, and then we decide no, or they say, we don't want you to leave, a change of heart, have a change of mind. And that's why the second pasuk, the first pasuk tells Mitzrayim Kabrim, and the second pasuk tells us that despite the concern that we might have that Bnei Israel would be chased, or that Bnei Israel would be in danger, or that the Mitzrayim would refuse for Bnei Israel to leave. Right, so he says that's why the pasuk. If we look at it now, we read the pasukim in order. It says, the first pasuk says, "Mimacharat Pesach yitzu Bnei Israel b'yad ramah l'nei kol Mitzrayim," and the second pasuk is Mitzrayim Kabrim Elohim Asah Shvatim. So now we understand the second pasuk better. The second pasuk is telling him that in the morning, when the Jews when Bnei Israel were leaving, the Mitzrayim were busy burying the dead in the house of in their home, in the house of the idols, right? And then they noticed what Hashem did. So it was like a double makah. We think that we were all raised on the fact that Makat Bechorot is a one-time thing. Hashem did it, and then he killed the firstborns throughout Mitzrayim, right? And then the next morning, that's why it says Mimarchat Pesach. During the day, when the Mitzrayim were so busy burying their loved ones, that's when Mitzrayim, who were now taking their loved ones into the Batei Avodah Zarah, into the homes of their idol worship, they started seeing what was actually Hashem did, inflicted not only on their firstborns but also on their idols, and therefore there was no threat because the potential threat of being told to stay in Mitzrayim, or that Bnei Israel would be in danger, they were no longer in danger because they were so busy during the day of having to deal with the funeral arrangements that they only had time once they were dealing with that and went into the house of idol worship. Did they notice what was going on with the idols themselves? In Cain, it continues, Nikra Shata Makah Mamash. Right, so this therefore was this was actually part of the Makkah. So we all were raised that the Makkah was Makkah Bechorot, but in fact, the Makkah Bechorot, part of Makkah Bechorot was also the fact that Hashem inflicted punishment on the Avodah Zarah itself, and it was therefore there was no way for the Mitzrayim to renege or go back on their idea to let Mitzrayim out, because they were not really. They were in the middle of a plague. The Makkah didn't end. The Makkah only ended when the Mitzrayim actually got to their Batei Avodah Zarah and saw what was going on. That was when the end of the plague. VaKadosh Baruch Hu ratzah sheyagishu af b'makazu leYisrael mishum hacha himtin yetziatam ad haboker. Hashem wanted not only for the Mitzrayim to see that he could kill the firstborn, which it did with the Makkah Bechorot that we all know about, but he wanted to show them that he's in charge. So he said, I'm going to inflict a punishment on them, on their gods as well. And therefore he said, he made sure that he delayed Bnei Israel's departure from Mitzrayim until the morning, so that now we can understand why the two psukim come together. One is the first one is at the end, the next morning. Now we understand why it talks about the next morning. And the second pasuk, which is Umitzrayim Mikabrim, means that they're literally burying their dead, and Hashem did an inflicted punishment upon their Avodah Zarah. Those two things were happening simultaneously, and those two things were happening only in the morning when they could actually, after the Makat Bechorot, the part 1 happened. Makat Bechorot part 2 is what Hashem did in terms of the Mitzrayim noticing that their gods themselves were actually punished as well. So the first pasuk teaches us that about the delay of Yetziat Mitzrayim until the morning, and the second one is telling us why Hashem did this and why He was not concerned that the Mitzrayim would actually go back in their plan, because the Mitzrayim were so busy burying their dead the next morning, they would only discover then how much punishment Hashem inflicted on their idols too, and therefore since the Mitzrayim would see their idols been destroyed, they would feel like they were still in the middle of the plague, and they would not go back on their original permission. Now he has a question. Zera Shimshon continues. It says, "V'ati shapir nami shamar katuv biyad ramah." The code word here is biyad ramah, and it's similar to what he's going to mention it later. It says the word Vayad Ramah is a unique phrase. So he says, now we can understand, according to what we just said, we can understand why it says that Bnei Israel left with an upraised hand, like Yad Ramah is a strong hand, like a Yad Ramah is opposed. Most of the places when describing how Hashem took Bnei Israel out of Mitzrayim, it talks about Yad Chazakah. And that's what we say in the Haggadah. Yad Ramah is used only one other time, and that's used in right before Az Yashir, in Parshat Bashalach. And it says, so he says, the fish, here, unlike in the Psukim when it's talking about how Hashem took Bnei Israel out of Mitzrayim, it's talking about Yad Chazakah. But here, it's talking about Yad Ramah to teach us something about to teach us about the punishment that Hashem inflicted upon the gods of Mitzrayim. Yad Ramah means that upraised means higher. Ra means to be higher. So Yad Ramah means that Hashem was trying to show that He is higher above all the other gods. Right, as I mentioned in Parshat Bashalach, it says Bnei Yisrael yotzim biyad Ramah. Mishum dahatam nami ma'ir she'achzru lifnei Baal Tzafon. What do we know about in that context? Hashem tells Bnei Yisrael to go back. Biyad Ramah in this case and in that case are both trying to teach us something about how Hashem was trying to prove to the world that He is the greatest, that He is the God of gods. And so therefore it mentions that word only in these two places. And in some ways, the Zera Shimshon is doing like what they call a Zera Shavai. He's making an inference between the two, comparison between the two. And he says that in that context, it was that Hashem tells Bnei Israel to make a turn, meaning they leave Mitzrayim and go back around to the other side and wait at this place called Baal Tzafon. What was Baal Tzafon? Shenishar b'kol Elohei Mitzrayim. This was the last idol, the last, Avodah Zara of Mitzrayim was called Baal Tzafon. Kedei lahatotam. And Hashem made this. Why did Hashem make this commandment to Bnei Israel? To trick the Mitzrayim to chasing Bnei Israel into a certain point, and then what would the Mitzrayim think? They would think that the Baal Tzafon, the last standing idol, would help them out. But then what would happen is Biyad Ramah. It's teaching us that Hashem again proved to the Mitzrayim that not only will he do something, but he'll do it in a way that they'll see and realize that Hashem is Ram. Hashem is high. He is the highest of all the gods. Now that we understood the perspective of the Mitzrayim and why and how the Mitzrayim were so preoccupied with Makat Bechorot, they didn't even notice that the fact that their idols were destroyed. Now we're going to understand the other side, which is how Bnei Israel what was going on in Bnei Israel's side. A little bit of context before saying this: is in Parshat Beshalach. It says Chamushim alu Bnei Israel me'er Mitzrayim. So most Mefarshim say Chamushim means that 4/5 of Bnei Israel were decimated during Makat Choshech, as a way to punish them for what they were doing. Meaning they didn't believe in Hashem, or they didn't understand, they didn't want to leave, whatever it may be. Aval Yisrael kiblu alehem din shamayim v'simcha. And so the Zera Shimshon says that the Jewish people, Bnei Israel, accepted the fact that the harsh din that was about to take place, when their loved ones were being killed and were being decimated being punished during this time of Makat Choshech, Bnei Israel accepted it with love. Shneimar l'chol Bnei Israel haya or b'moshvotam. As the pasuk says, that all of Bnei Israel had light in their dwellings. V'kasheh ma'u b'moshvotam. Right? And what does it mean when it says moshvotam? Haya lo l'mar haya or b'tulo, where we don't need b'moshvotam. The word moshvotam just says Bnei Israel had light. There's obviously the reason to teach us something. There's a word. The word b'moshvotam teaches us something. So the question: what does it teach us? Therefore, he says. So the extra word of Moshvotam comes to teach us something about what Chazal say in the Midrash in Shemot Rabbah. We know the famous Midrash is that what did Bnei Israel do when there was Makat Choshech? Bnei Israel went into the house of the Mitzrayim and picked up the gold and picked up the jewelry and picked up the wealth. How could it be, right? If we know that they were preoccupied and they were looking through for riches and gold and whatever it is and treasures, how could they be so busy looking for treasures if what? If their loved ones were being punished and were being there was some sort of punishment. Shouldn't they have been mourning and sad for the fact that their family and loved ones were being, 4/5 of the Am Yisrael were being decimated is not some small number. Al Kroveim Valachem Shemetu, they should have been sad for the fact that their relatives and their brothers and they were being killed. Ki arba chalakim metu b'shloshem me'afilah. Right, as we know, Rashi says, based on the Midrash, the 4/5 or 1/5, whichever you want to look at, the 4/5, 80% of Bnei Israel were punished during Makat Choshech. So it doesn't make sense that they were looking at, you have Or b'moshvotam, doesn't make sense to say that they had light and they were going around looking for treasures. They should have been busy, just like the Mitzrayim were busy, Kal v'chomer, just like the Mitzrayim were busy with their Bechorot, we should have been learned that Bnei Israel were also busy, sad, whatever it may be. So how could it be that they had light in their houses? So there's obviously another reason. If we look, excuse me. So the Zera Shimshon continues his answer. Now he answers. Now we said, based on the Shulchan Aruch, Yerodea says, in the Halchot Avilut, it says, Kol ha'porshim midarchei tzibur, anyone who separates themselves, cuts himself off from the way of the community, that is, the Jewish way, U'frokim ol mitzvot me'al tzavaram, and they reject remove the yoke of mitzvot, the old mitzvot, off their necks. Ve'ein nichlalim b'chlal Yisrael. They are not included among Am Yisrael. Ein onenim elhem. You don't become an onen. An onen is a person who, between the time they die and the time they're buried, the person who's alive, the avel is not considered an avel until after they're buried. The onen is someone who is in between, in an in-between stage. And no one's meant to mourn for them. It says rather, and the opposite. They should go out and, I don't want to say here, the Shulchan Aruch, and I wouldn't want to misquote the Shulchan Aruch, he says that they wrap themselves in white, a sign of happiness. White is usually a sign of happiness or purity. They're actually happy. What does that mean? I'm not sure in today's day and age. But overall, excuse me, the Shulchan Aruch seems to say that a person who's not connected to Torah mitzvot, who I guess rejects it, not necessarily someone who's not connected, someone who rejects it, and is not associated with Am Yisrael, so therefore their relatives, even though they're sad, they don't have to have avelut. That's according to Shulchan Aruch. I don't think we hold that way nowadays. Af elu shemetu. Now the Zera Shimshon uses that halacha to apply to here. So Bnei Yisrael, the people who died during the Yimei Choshech, during the time of darkness, tam mitatam hayam mipnei shelo hayu rotzim ol mitzvot ulikhlei b'chlei Yisrael. The reason why they were killed is because they didn't want to be involved in Am Yisrael, and they didn't want to be included among the people that wanted to leave Mitzrayim. Uleficha kroveim lo itablu alehem ela adraba samchu mod ki ba'avod rishayim rina. So it says the opposite. Not only did they their relatives did not mourn for them, so they were able to go look for treasures during that time. But not only that, they were actually, in some ways, I don't want to say happy, but the Zera Shimshon quotes the pasuk that says when an evildoer, a rasha, is punished, we are allowed to be in some way a little bit happy. We're allowed to be. There's some sort of joy. It's based on a pasuk in Mishlei. Now he says, "Uvayamim kadmonim hayu osim moshavot v'amadot v'chazartam min hakever." In the olden days, in the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, there was a certain ceremony. And today we now do something similar to that, or in commemoration of it. We do like what's called we say the Parak Tilim Yosef Yisrael Elyon. You say it 7 times. It's to commemorate this minhag. They would do is what's called moshavot u'ma'amadot. They would sit down, and then they would get up. Sit down and get up on their way back from the burial. Lachen amar katuv ki Yisrael lo hayu osim moshavot v'avelim alachem. During the time Matot Choshech, Bnei Yisrael were not doing this custom of the moshavot, and that's why it says they didn't have v'chol Bnei Yisrael haya or b'moshavotam. Right? They did during the Makat Choshech. The people who were still alive did not perform this ritual of Moshavot. Rather, for Bnei Israel, there was light in their sitting tributes, meaning that you can use Moshavotam can mean 2 separate things. It can mean Moshavotam, like what we usually traditionally translated as means their homes or their dwelling place, but it could also mean their sitting, meaning their ritual of sitting, the moshav. So therefore it says that they had light. Instead of being sad and they were sitting down and performing this ritual, the opposite, they had light. They had light at the time of the time of doing moshavot, which would be otherwise a time of mourning. They had light. Whether it means that they accepted it, whether it means they actually were joyous about it, either way, Bnei Israel, the people who survived the Makkah, they accepted the fact. They accepted it they accepted the deen, and they were in some ways accepting the fact that the people that were punished were not either willing to leave, they didn't want to leave, or the fact that they actually were rejected Hashem, and therefore. They did not actually mourn the people that were punished. Rather, during the 3 days, they had light, meaning instead of doing things that were sad or attributed to being sad, they had light and they were able to go through the houses of the Mitzrayim. So what do we learn from here? We learn 2 pieces. Part 1, we learn that two different events took place during Makat Bechorot. Makat Bechorot is part one, is the actual killing of the Bechorot of Mitzrayim. Part two is that Hashem waited, you could say it's like the extension of that Makat is that he waited for the next morning after the Korban Pesach and after Makat Bechorot to have the mass exodus of Bnei Israel in order for the Mitzrayim to see what was going on with their idols. Meaning Hashem continued to do a Makat, which is, it's two Makot, really. Makat number one is the killing of Bechorot, and Makat number two is that he also punished all their gods. And in order for them to be able to see, and from the Mitzrayim to see Bnei Israel, and he did it in the broad daylight, he wanted to make sure that the Mitzrayim saw Bnei Israel, or were at least realized what was going on. Hashem delayed it did he not only delay it so that Mitzrayim would see Bnei Israel leaving, but what he did is he created a situation in which they were so busy with burying their children and their firstborns that they didn't get, the next morning when they were actually conducting the funerals, when they walked into the houses of Avodah Zarah, they actually saw what Hashem did also, another thing. And that's why he uses the word Yad Ramah. The second part of the drush is that what was the perspective of Bnei Israel? Unlike the Mitzrayim, which were sad and mourning, and they just kept on getting beat and getting another beating, first their firstborn and then their idols, etc. Bnei Israel, whether they willingly accepted it or they were happy about it, whatever it may be, was that they had light. And the light here is saying is that in a time when their people around them were being killed off and decimated, during the time of Makat Choshech, Bnei Israel, the ones who did survive, were accepting Hashem's din, they were accepting it in a positive way, so they could have it in a positive light. And so therefore, those people who did not make it, who chose either because they didn't want to be part of it, they were porek ol, they wanted to take off the yoke of Hashem and Mitzvot, or they rejected it, or they just didn't want to leave Mitzrayim. So during Makat Choshech, Hashem said, no problem, I'm going to take care of you, and I'm also going to take care of the people who do by giving them light so that they can actually go out into the houses of Mitzrayim and collect the riches. So now that was Drush 1, and now that was the first Drush of this week's Parsha, of the Parshat Masai. And now, let's go to Drush Gimel.
Hi.
So Drush Gimel is based on the Haftorah of Parshat Masai, which is not often read, but the Zera Shimshon generally, almost on every sefer, every parsha, he finds one thing connected to the Haftorah. He tries to ask one question about the Haftorah. And so here, he's going to start with the Drush. He starts with Psukim from the Haftorah of Parshat Masai, and then he's going to continue by picking up other pieces from these 3 weeks. The last week it started after Yud B'Tammuz. Last week, this week, and next week, all three are sad, discussing mourning and rebuke, and how low did Bnei Israel do before the Churban. And then after Tisha B'Av, you have what's called the Shiva de Nechemta, the 7 kind of comforting Haftorah between the 7 weeks between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah. And so those 7 weeks are much more inspiring, to pick us up from where we were after in the time of Tisha B'Av. So he's going to connect that as well.
Amazing.
So he says in the Haftorah of this week's parsha of Parshat Masai, it says Mamatzu avotechem bi'avel ki chaku me'alai. The beginning of the Haftorah, it says, what wrong did I do to your forefathers? There's Hashem talking to Bnei Israel kivechol, that you distance yourself from me. Meaning in the Sefer, in the Navi Yirmiyahu says kivechol, that Hashem tells Bnei Israel, what did I do wrong? Did I do anything wrong? Did I not stick to my side of the bargain? Did I do something to your forefathers, or did I not do something to your forefathers? Kasheh, ech sal gadatach. The Drush continues. it's a very difficult pasuk to understand. How could Echsach Gedach de Lomar Shakadosh Baruch Hu Yesh Ava Chas V'Shalom? Could we say? Could I even have the chutzpah to say that Hashem had done something wrong, right? V'yesh Lomar. So this is a little bit of we have to understand a little bit, but hopefully as we move along with the Drush, it becomes clearer and clearer. And he says the halacha is that with a promise, it says Matzinu b'shulchan aruch yored dei siman reish lavav sif vav shnaim shenishba'u la'asot davar echad. Two people swore to each other to fulfill a certain matter between them. It could be a business partnership, it could be a marriage, right? If it says here, and he says, Va'avar echad mehem al shvuah. One of them decided to violate the oath, failing to keep his part of the commitment. Hasheni patur. The second one is exempt from his side. Ve'no tzarich hatran. He doesn't need to be required to annul it. Why? Because if we both swear to do the same thing, we both swear to do it, commit to something, and one of us reneges on the commitment, the other person, it's as if the whole commitment is broken up, and therefore the other person is scot-free. Lefichach ish ve'isha shenishtadchu lazeh lazeh. A man and a woman become engaged to be married. V'kiblu cherem l'naseh l'zman kabul. Let's say that Reuven and Rachel decide to get engaged, and they say, okay, we're going to get married on the first week, at some day on Tu B'Av. They're going to get married on Tu B'Av, and they accept upon themselves, and they swear that they're going to get married on Tu B'Av. Mi sha'avar ve'avir hamoed. Let's say one of them decides, for whatever reason, between now and Tu B'Av, he says, you know what? Or she says, one of them, doesn't make a difference which one it is. One of them says, I want to delay the marriage. One of them violates oath and is not ready to get married on that day, on Tu B'Av. Asur li naseh lecha. That person, the person who stepped out of the commitment, is not allowed to get married. Part one. Part two, v'hala mutar. The second party, the one who was rejected, if you will, that person is permitted to get married right away with no need for a tanai and no tzarach hatara. He doesn't need to be his oath, his shvuah doesn't need to be annulled. Furthermore, the one who delayed, meaning the person who said, I don't want to get married on that day, he or she is only allowed to get married once the person who was rejected gets married first. Meaning, so they punish, but the halacha is that he gets punished, or she gets punished. And not only that, nevertheless, the other party who is ready to get married on that fixed date, if he wants to exempt himself for the oath, Shema zeh she'avir hamoed v'ikev yavi edim she'ah ba'ones v'nimtza zeh she'negdo avar shvuato. Right? Ad kalu sheno. So the halacha is that if there's a person who said, I'm committed to get married this day, even after being rejected, he can, if he wants to, even though he's exempt, he could say, I can go back. He can go back and he can annul even the other party who was ready to be married on the fixed day, on the Tu B'Av that was in our situation. If he wants to exempt himself from the shvuah, he doesn't need hatara, but he wants to exempt himself from the shvuah. He should go to a chacham and tell him that it was onus. It was like I was forced. It was I was in an unavoidable situation that basically I couldn't fulfill the commitment. I was forced basically out of the marriage that I originally had, and therefore then emerged that this other party to protect against this such an error. It is advisable that to have the oath annulled. Meaning that he doesn't want to be in a situation where he's going against his shvuah that he has. If you look further on in Parshat Vayelech, the Zera Shimshon has a Drush Gimel, also talks about this idea. Now we're going to bring it back to this week's Parsha and to Bnei Israel, etc. Ukvar Yisrael nishbula Kadosh Baruch Hu l'kayem mitzvotav. Bnei Israel had already accepted upon themselves, they swore, according to Masai Gittin Daf Nun Zayin Amud Bet, it says there, the Bnei Israel swore to Hashem to observe his mitzvot, v'shalol avodah zarah, not to worship avodah zarah. V'af HaKadosh Baruch Hu nishba lehem, shelo yachlifan b'imah acheret, v'lo yaniach et Yisrael le'olam, and he will never get rid of Am Yisrael. We will never forsake Am Yisrael. And he says, "V'zoi kavanat katuv," and this is what it means when the Haftorah he says, "Bishlama Im kshenitachaktem mimeno avartem hashvua hayagam hu mitrachek mikem. Right? If we would, what would have happened when Bnei Israel decided to do avodah zarah? Because that's what the Navi is talking about when they say, you Bnei Israel, did I do anything wrong to your forefathers that you decided that, did I do anything wrong to make you consider doing avodah zarah that you wanted to die, run away from me? So it would have made sense that once Bnei Israel did avodah zarah, Hashem says, well, you didn't live up to your side of the deal, I don't have to live up to mine. Right? There's Hashem could have distanced them. As the halacha does say that the one who says I'm committed is permitted to basically undo his oath, because why? One side of the party, that is Bnei Israel in this case, in the mashal, he's using the halacha as a mashal. The mashal is that Bnei Israel rejected Hashem, so therefore kiviyachol Hashem could say I don't have to without any undo it, without any hatarat nedarim or anything. Then Bnei Israel could do what? Bnei Israel could continue to do avodah zarah chas v'chalila. Right? The person that is in this case Hashem, once Bnei Israel, once in the halacha is that the first person rejects the commitment that he made. He undoes the commitment. So as soon as the other party gets married, so the person who rejected the commitment can then get married too. So once in the Mishal, once Bnei Israel said we want to go to avodah zarah, Hashem says no problem. You've committed yourself. You've married yourself to avodah zarah. So Hashem could say no problem. I'll go find someone else to make a commitment to. Right? Right? In this case, Hashem fulfilled his oath, despite being exempt from it, because even though he should have been exempt from it, because why? Bnei Israel didn't comply. They were vid avodah zarah. Kedeita b'midrash. Kol mash nishbati la'avachem lo kiyamtiyah. Nishbati lahem shani mevarech b'nehem. Shani motzi otchem b'rechush gadol. Lo kiyamtiyah. Lo kiyamti. Hashem is still in compliance with his commitment. In fact, in the midrash says that, is there anything that I told the forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, anyone, that from the time that we committed to each other, from that moment on, everything that was going to happen, happened. Is there anything that I didn't do? Umamatzu, and that's why it says, Mamatzu avadechem bi'ava ki rachakum el. What wrong did I say to you? Did I do to your avota, that is their forefathers, that you distanced themselves from me? Meaning, I didn't do anything. Everything I said was going to happen, I committed myself to, even though I had right to say, Hashem is kiviyachol saying, even though I right, 100% right to do what? To get out of the commitment. Now we understand why Hashem basically says that he did nothing wrong. And now we understand a little bit of the context in that the Jewish people would be permitted to ignore their part of and continue to serve idols. Hashem was therefore saying that he did not exercise the right to exchange the Jewish people for another nation. So since he didn't do it, he was still on the side of the commitment, right? So he says he had not committed anything wrong. So therefore, the Jewish people were still bound in some ways to the commitment that they made. Since Hashem was staying on his commitment, meaning he didn't quote unquote marry another person. So that means that the first party can't get married. The one who rejected can't get remarried. So that means that Bnei Israel, in some ways, are still committed, even though they did commit avodah zarah. Now, if we go to the next part of the Drush, it brings it all together, and I think it's a very great way to bring us into the right mindset when in these times of these weeks. V'zeu shamar katuv ki irisha azuva v'atzuva ruach karacha Hashem. In the maftir, the haftarah of Parshat Ki Tetzei, we see that the pasuk says that if you're for like a wife who has been forsaken and sad, Hashem called us like a wife that was been forsaken and sad. What does it mean to say that he's like a wife that's forsaken and is melancholy or sad? Why does he call Bnei Israel such terms? Now bringing back the halakha that we learned before. According to the halakha there, where a man and a woman swear to each other to get married, Mish ekev asur li naser lacher. Mish, the person who delayed, is forbidden to marry. The other party is allowed to get married even without a hatarat nidarim. V'imkein ha'ish zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So he says in this case, the mashal is that the Hashem is the ish, and the isha is Bnei Yisrael. V'Yisrael ikvu, and the woman was the one who said, she broke up her side of the oath. Shesaru me'achrei Hashem v'lo alchu b'drachav. They turned away and said, what? We're going to do avodah zarah. Ve'hem asurim l'naseh acher. They are forbidden to marry another person. Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu mutar she'ach lifem. Hashem had all the right, according to halacha, he had all the right to do what? He said, I can go find someone else. V'zeu she'amar ki isha azuvah. This is why the pasuk says that the Jewish people are like a wife who had been forsaken. She'a'ish k'shera'ah she'yikva. The woman, the man, that is Hashem, when he saw that the woman, that in this case Bnei Yisrael, delayed and they're not willing to fulfill their commitment, right? He nicha, he, that is Hashem, v'lo nasa'u panav libola ela, and he no longer paid attention to her, to Bnei Yisrael. Lachen nikra azuvah, and that's why she is called forsaken. The Jewish people were forsaken by Hashem. V'od hiyatzavir roch, and she is still sad. She'ina yichola linaseh acher, but she can't marry someone else. Why can't she marry anyone else? Because the other person, the one who was committed, in this case Hashem, never remarried. I mean, he didn't choose another nation. Had he chosen another nation, Bnei Yisrael could have said, okay. But here, Hashem says, I'm committed, I'm still here, I'm not getting remarried. And since I'm not getting remarried, according to the halacha, the woman is like a forsaken, means that the woman is stuck. In this case, Bnei Yisrael are stuck. Because even though they committed avodah zarah, Hashem says, no, I'm here. And since he didn't get remarried, I mean, he didn't commit a new shvuah with another nation, Bnei Yisrael are considered azuvah. Isha azuvah v'rechoka. She's sad. Shadayni b'shvuah. She's still considered she's still, that is, Bnei Yisrael is still considered part of committed to the oath. Asha'afal pi shechata Yisrael hu. Even though he sinned, even though a Jew sins, the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that even though a Jew sins, he's still considered a Jew, right? And this is why the pasuk, that same pasuk says that a wife of one's youth had become despised. If you had observed the oath, then I would never have been despised you. But I despised you. Why did Hashem get angry? Hashem got angry to do what? Because you did something that you promised me when you were younger, that you wouldn't reject me by doing avodah zarah, and then you did. So therefore, Hashem says, "But I'm committed to you." Sorry, I did not abandon you, and I didn't exchange you for another nation. Then I would have completely abandoned you, and then you would have been, your side of the deal would have been, because I abandoned you, that is Hashem saying to Bnei Israel, that had I chosen another nation, then you wouldn't have had no problem to go do what you wanted to do with the avodah zarah, kivyachol. Since the person who was committed got remarried, then the person who delayed is also mutar. But this is not the case, and rather the pasuk says, for a brief moment I've forsaken you. And immediately after it says, abundant mercy I will bring you back in. Hashem had not abandoned these people; they were still bound by their oath, by their shvuah. Why did Hashem not? He had all the right to exchange it. Hashem had all the right to say, well, you rejected me, I'll reject you. If the women, the one who delays, if he brings witnesses that she was unable to marry by the fixed time, then the other party is not permitted to violate the oath. If the Jewish people would claim that they were coerced to violate their oath, Hashem would still be bound by his. And it's for this possibility that it says, with a slight wrath I have concealed my countenance from you from a moment. That I showed my anger towards you for only a moment. Immediately, but with eternal kindness, I show you rachamim. Hashem was that stood by his part of the shvuah, because the Jewish people could claim that it was like onus, that they were in some ways coerced to violate the oath. Why were they coerced? And he's going to say this. Lama amar b'chesed olam. Why is it? We have to understand what does it mean b'chesed olam. If the Hashem's anger lasted only a moment, then it was replaced with kindness. Then why do we say that the chesed was olam? If it was shetzef ketzef, I got you slight wrath. I hid myself. Then the chesed should not be olam. And then va'od mashayach at the end of that week's haftorah, at the end of the haftorah, it says va'od mashayach acha shuat mabul kimei noach zotli. And at the end of the pasuk, it says at the end of the haftarah, it says kimei noach zotli. It's like the waters of Noach. Just like I swore that the waters of Noach, that's the pasuk is just like I swore at the time of Noach that there would never be another flood to that level. So I was sworn not to be angry with you nor rebuke you. Right? So that's the pasuk. What does one have to do with the other? And why do we have to call it a chesed olam? So he says, V'yesh lomar, the Parshat Noach, in the beginning of our Parshat Noach, it says, Ki yetzer lev ha'adam ra min urav. Hashem says that the yetzer hara is already evil, is already ingrained within us, even when we're young. Uvishvil zeh kadesh lo lachriv olam kama pamim. The Torah says that because of this, so as not to constantly be destroying the world, because of the sins, the things that we did, the averot that we do, nishba kadosh baruch hu shelo yavi od mabul. Hashem says He will never bring another mabul. Yan bnei adam anusim mitzram. Meaning Hashem, the people are coerced. Meaning they have the yetzer hara built in within them, and so in some ways the yetzer hara is coercing them to do the sin, right? The nur of Anu Devisra, right? The yetzer hara is a fire, and we are flesh. What happens when a fire and flesh happens? The flesh gets burnt, right? It's too difficult to overcome the yetzer hara at all times, right? We all are nichshal in some way, shape, or form. And since we're all nichshal, the beginning of in the beginning of Parshat Noach, or the middle of Parshat Noach, it says yetzer lev ha'adam ra minu rav. And so he says, "V'afkan yomer Yisrael." So too, Bnei Yisrael could say, "Anusima yunibi yitzreinu." We were coerced to sin because of the yetzer hara. Umasha ikavnu eno klum, and therefore our delaying, meaning we are committing, showing our full commitment to you, is not significant. And you're not able to exchange us. And that's why it says, and that's why Hashem says, chesed olam. Right, a kindness of that I'm going to show you mercy. Just as I keep the world alive and fulfilled and straight and going, and I commit myself that I will not make another flood to the levels and the portions and the grandiose nature that I had at the time of Noach. Because why? Because people are coerced in some way by their yetzer hara. Like at the time of Noach, Hashem wiped out the earth. But if every time the Am Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, and the world would be destroyed, or Hashem would destroy the world every time that the sins were so great, the world would have to be constantly rebuilt. And so that's why He made the commitment. Just as I swore at the time of Noach, I would never again destroy the earth. So too I have sworn not to be wrathful or nor to rebuke you. Yan anusu at Yisrael. But why? So too I have sworn not to take out my wrath, not to show my anger on you. Why? Because I realized that the yetzer hara. You could always say that. You could always claim that I was. Why? I see. Hashem says I realize that you are anus. In some way, you are anus, and therefore I have to have show rachamim, and that's why it's called chesed olam. The chesed olam is that Hashem shows His ongoing chesed and rachamim to what's going on, because He realized that person is just human, and so we made a mistake. So we did avodah zarah or whatever we did. It teaches us many lessons about Hashem's love for us. It also teaches us that even when we think that Hashem is in kivyachol masir panim, He still loves us and He still shows us. It's a moment of a split of a second, and even at that moment we see that Hashem hugs us and He brings us closer, and that's why the pasuk at the Shetzev Ketzef Istarti Panai, and for a split second, I turned my head away. Umiyad, and right afterwards, the pasuk continues. It says, "B'chesed olam richamtich," that with the love and the chesed olam, ongoing chesed. Why? Because I realized that you're ingrained with the yetzer hara. So the yetzer hara, sometimes people, unfortunately, give in to the yetzer hara, and therefore we learn that Hashem's love for us is greater, and therefore Hashem swears never to bring another flood and never to punish us. Because why? Because we have a Yetzer Hara, and therefore we understand that in this time the nechama is that even though Hashem got angry at us, or Hashem turned around his head at us for a few seconds, Hashem's commitment to us is chesed olam, because he says that there's always going to be some level of Yetzer Hara that is going to, in some way, that there's our Yetzer Hara, we're going to give into our Yetzer Hara in some ways. So Hashem is going to constantly show His chesed and never abandon us, even though we started the whole Torah with the idea that perhaps in the beginning, even though at the beginning we said that halachically, quote unquote, according to the halacha, he may have the right reason to do so. Hashem says no, because you could always claim your anus. You could always claim that you have the onus as the Yetzer Hara. And since you can always claim that, Hashem says, I committed to you in that way. But Bezrat Hashem, we can see that we can, during these dark days, perhaps we can continuously find ways to see Hashem's kindness, not only by seeing Hashem's kindness, but also acting and performing acts of kindness to other people, and so that we can see the Binyan Beit HaMikdash. Baruch Adonai Olam, Amen.